Come, spellweavers, reavers, rogues, and men-at-arms, and answer the call of adventure. Pick up your sword, your axe, your spellbook, your bow, your rulebook, and your dice, and join the forces of good in their eternal fight against vile monsters, conspiring min-maxers, horny bards, and blood-soaked murder hobos. Discover the treasure trove of role-playing games here on Rollin Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide. Good evening, Boneheads, and welcome back to Rollin Bones with Ryan Howard, where we are making old school young again. I'm your host and king of the Boneheads, Ryan Howard, and tonight we are going to be talking about a historical event that was very significant to European history and also to the history of the United States, very significant to my family's personal history, and just something that's generally not talked a lot about even in academic circles, and that is the English Civil Wars. But this is not going to be strictly a history lesson because myself and DM Blackwall, we are going to be discussing the English Civil War in the context of how it can help you implement sectarian conflict and kind of religious strife in your tabletop games to create intrigue and create situations where all kinds of shenanigans can happen that your player characters can get involved in. And I am really looking forward to this conversation. Again, like I said, this is a period of time where a lot of significant consequences kind of flow down from. This is one of the reasons why you have so much English and Scottish colonialism in the United States. There's a whole lot to discuss tonight. But before we get into that, one, I want to remind everyone that if you haven't done so already, remember to go out and make a friend today. I know it's late for some of you, but remember to go out and make a friend today. It's not as hard as you might think it is. I also want to remind everyone that you can find me on all of our various social media platforms. You can find me here on X and Instagram at Howard_Ryan Gregg. YouTube is Rollin Bones, and Twitch is twitch.tv/RollinBonesRyan. And of course, Substack is rollinbones.substack.com. Just today, I posted my first ever premium article, one that is behind the paywall entirely. It is a preview and a playtest report of some of the stuff coming up in O Night Divine, my upcoming Christmas adventure, which is still scheduled to be released on December 25th. So you can find that over rollinbones.substack.com. I will put the link over here in chat. And also want to remind everyone that you can support me by buying merch over on TeePublic. I've got some great designs up there on TeePublic, so if you enjoy that kind of stuff, you can find that. Also want to remind everyone that we have DM Blackwall in the house tonight, so you can find his game Horde Wars Basic over at Big Geek Emporium. It is doing quite well over there. It is a really great game. Last time he was on the show, we actually created a character together. You can still find that over on YouTube, but if you haven't already, go check out DM Blackwall's Horde Wars Basic. It is a really cool, really fun game, and I really appreciate you guys not just supporting me, but supporting my guests. And before we bring on the man of the hour, I want to remind everyone to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy what we are doing here. So, without further ado, let's bring on the expert, the historian who is going to be helping us in this conversation. Like I said, he is the creator of Horde Wars Basic. You guys know him and love him. Welcome back to Rollin Bones, DM Blackwall.
Good to be here. My main qualification for this discussion is I've read a bunch of Cromwell's writing, mostly letters he wrote during the period to a whole bunch of people that were collected about 30 years after his death and then published.
Yep. And I salute you for having knowledge of the primary sources, because I don't. And uh, a lot of people who engage in these conversations about history, especially nowadays, don't. There's there seems to be this allergy to actually understanding the people of time periods past in the context of their period. There's always kind of this approach now of the past was bad and we can't understand these people in their context. We have to understand them in our cultural context. So, we don't need to know what they were thinking, or we don't need to read what they were saying because they were lying or racist, or, whatever it was that you want to kind of paint people of the past with.
Yeah. So, what did you want to talk about first, right?
I think to start the conversation, what was kind of your first examination or reading on this particular subject? Where were you first exposed to kind of knowledge of the English Civil War?
Well, I first learned about it in school. I was at the time pursuing a social studies group major, which included a history minor, and so I got to study this both in high school and in college. But my own reading of the primary sources was fairly recent. It was actually during the pandemic when I wound up with a bunch more free time than I would normally have. Because my work at the time was security work, and there were a bunch of people just not doing anything for months or a year or more. And so I was able to do significantly more reading and listening to podcasts than I had ever previously. And so during that time, I read I read through several of Julius Caesar's books, and I read through this collection of Cromwell's writings and a bunch of other things as well.
Gotcha.
But as a general understanding of the period, I think what drew me to it, what got me interested in it, is actually the 1632 book series by Eric Flint, and I'm trying to remember the other guy, David Weber. It's a fictional series, but it begins in a historical context and then diverges. It's historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so he adds a sci-fi element, but before then, everything is true to history, and then stuff diverges. Anyway, that got me really interested in the period. Like, this is a time period where Shakespeare's alive, where the 30 Years' War is raging in Europe, one of the most destructive wars probably in history, other than the world wars. And then at the same time, you've got the Roman Catholic Church's last gasp at political domination of the planet is really what they were going for. If they had managed to win one of this series of conflicts, it is very likely that they would have returned to their previous policy of trying to split the world among countries like Portugal and Spain. I'm sure you're familiar with that idea.
Yeah. At this time, you really are dealing with kind of this idea of mass reconquista. Because again, to remind everyone what's going on in Europe at this time, you're about 100 years removed from the Reformation. So the Reformation has had 100 years plus to spread all throughout Europe. It's really taken hold in Germany. It's really taken hold in Switzerland and Sweden specifically. And there was a little bit of a Reformation in England. There was a major Reformation in Scotland. And we find ourselves in the situation where England is kind of weak tea Protestant at this point, because, with apologies to anyone out there who might be an Anglican, all Anglicanism really is diet Catholicism that Henry VIII had invented so that he could get divorced. There's not a whole lot of actual tradition to Anglicanism. Uh, to be blunt about it, it's really just
Yeah.
Catholicism with divorces.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment.
And so you've got this major religious position of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is essentially a revolving door of, what politically powerful zealot uh, can push their agenda on the congregants of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, as it was called at the time, and you end up with an Arminian as the Archbishop of Canterbury, which really pisses off the Calvinists, both the Presbyterian variety and the kind of Congregationalist Puritan variety that was really kind of taking hold in England. And oh,
For those who aren't familiar, basically, Arminians and Calvinists are arguing about understanding how and why things happen in Scripture. They're generally both Christians, as far as like salvation through Christ, the afterlife, the creation of the world, pretty much major doctrines. Their arguments are about things like free will versus predestination.
Yep, absolutely. And as someone from the Calvinist tradition, you kind of know where my loyalties lie there. But
yeah,
you find this. This all kind of comes together under a king, King Charles I, who is nominally Protestant. He is of the Stuart line, which is the Scottish, from the Scottish royal family. So nominally Protestant, nominally Presbyterian. He is of the line of Mary Queen of Scots, who was a Presbyterian. So you have a guy who on paper is supposed to be Protestant friendly, but in practice is very much really not devout in any sense of the word. He ends up marrying a very strongly Catholic French queen, which really upsets the Parliament, which at this point was largely made up of Puritans and Calvinist Protestants.
Yeah, so at this point, right? So this is a couple monarchs after Queen Elizabeth. That's helpful for those of you who are familiar with her reign. So when Queen Elizabeth died, her cousin became the king of both England and Scotland. He had been the king of Scotland. This is that cousin's son. Yeah. And so Charles, at this point, is officially king of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Separately, not under one another, like as separate entities. The problem is the Irish are militantly Catholic. The Scottish are mostly militantly Presbyterian. And then the English are anti-Catholic and kind of split amongst a bunch of different groups. What winds up rising to the top eventually are the Puritans. But that is not terribly clear at the beginning of his reign. But anti-Catholic, that they all could get behind pretty much.
Yeah. And then over in Europe, to kind of tie that back in, you have this active Reconquista in the form of the 30 Years' War. You have the French Huguenots fighting the predominantly Catholic majority in France. You have Gustavus Adolphus and his descendants from Sweden kind of carrying the torch for Swedish Lutheranism.
And the Danes, too, intermittently.
Yep, the Danes as well, and the Dutch. Shout out to our friend Viktor Gorchev. And the Germans are also at this point kind of split, because you still have the Holy Roman Empire, but you also have the Lutherans, and so that's Basically, it's a war in continental Europe between the Catholics and the Lutherans, with a little bit of Calvinism thrown in the Netherlands and Switzerland, and that spills over into England, where you have noble Catholics. There's a lot of Catholics amongst the nobility who want Charles I to send support to the Catholics in mainland Europe. And then you have the Protestant parliament that does not want to be conscripted to go over and kill their brethren in Christ. And this is...
And ones who also want to side with the Swedes and help them directly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so as a result, Charles I does nothing.
Yeah. And so he's sitting on a powder keg of people that can't get along.
Yeah.
And he won't make a decision as far as where his loyalties lie religiously.
Mm-hmm.
And this eventually results in a series of wars. And because he couldn't be trusted to keep his word, as his life busily demonstrated, he wound up getting himself executed.
Yes, he
through
did.
a series of betrayals.
Mm-hmm.
And a refusal to compromise or even just make a commitment when given the opportunity repeatedly.
Yeah.
I mean, the man did things like surrendering to one of these kingdoms, Scotland in this case, who then traded him to the English. And then he made an alliance with Scotland. Like, this was not a wise man.
Mm-hmm.
He could have started with that. He could have started allying with the Scots, but no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's largely a buffoon, and the history has history's been very kind to Charles I in spite of all of this, because a lot of people will compare him favorably to the man who ultimately succeeded him as the ruler of England, and that is one Oliver Cromwell. So I think we should talk a little bit about the man that is Cromwell, as any discussion of the English Civil War without speaking on him would be incomplete.
That's fair, though a great deal of the winning for the parliamentarian army and for the new model army was up until the execution of the king was really Thomas Fairfax, with Cromwell as second in command or as commander of cavalry.
Yeah.
And Fairfax, interestingly, was the younger man by about 13 years, but was actually the senior general. And it wasn't until they Parliament wound up executing Charles that Fairfax essentially retired from political life for about 20 years, and Cromwell became dominant. Now, it's not terribly clear to me that this was whether or not he was forced out or whether or not he was, in fact, disgusted with how things went. I couldn't say. I haven't read his personal writings.
Mm-hmm.
But Cromwell then was the senior ranking military officer left and proceeded to win the subsequent series of wars against Charles' son, which was, I believe, also Charles II.
Yep, Charles II.
And against the Irish uprising and against the Scots, who both declared Charles II to be their king. In some case, I think in both cases, repeatedly, as things turned out. But anyway, so that was really when Cromwell took off. But as a military commander, once he was actually in charge, he was effective. He won a lot of battles. He lost some, but he won most battles. And also, as a general rule, you probably didn't want to surrender to him, at least if you were Irish.
Mm-hmm.
because that dude slaughtered garrison after garrison. To be
Yep.
fair, the first one repeatedly refused to surrender. And as far as standards of the time goes, once they did that 2 or 3 times and the wall was breached and it was clear it was over, then that would be a fairly normal response.
Yep.
However, he kept doing it after that,
Yep.
Which was not normal. And he commented, I don't remember his phrasing exactly, but it was something like, he basically commented that it was better to do it now, to have them bleed now, than to have continual fighting on and on and on. He wanted to just end the wars.
Yep. Yeah, he wanted the General Patton march all the way to Moscow approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, it was brutal, and it was quite a mess, the English Civil War. I mean, if you read about like the communications problems, frequently armies were marching within, a dozen miles of each other and then suddenly realizing the other was there.
Yep.
There were pockets that were on one side or another, just scattered throughout the country. It would be like, well, it would be a lot like if Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, 3 different groups, were all militant and suddenly went to war just wherever they were. I mean, that's basically what happened to England. There were 2 or 3 different groups that all went to war, and they weren't geographically distinct. And It took years of fighting to even get that sorted out.
Yeah, which is why you see when you look at a map, and this is one of the things, even though I don't personally subscribe to kind of their view of history, and I have a lot of questions about their sources of funding. The Kings and Generals YouTube channel, they have a 3.5-hour documentary and then several smaller videos kind of outlining the blow by blow of the English Civil War. And when you look at their map of kind of how the sides were divided up, you get these kind of weird chunks and enclaves of, here's this big giant Protestant territory, parliamentarian territory down here in the South with little spots of royalists. And then up north is a giant Cavalier royalist enclave, but the Scots are right on top of them. And there's all kinds of just kind of odd geographical divides between the different sides. And that's kind of ultimately, I think, what did it in for the royalists was just how scattered they were.
That and the lack of discipline for their cavalry.
Yeah.
Battle after battle that the royalists almost won, they were winning. Their cavalry would scamper off the field chasing one group or another, and then the battle would turn and their cavalry wouldn't be there to help bail them out. This happened, I think, something like 6 times.
Yeah.
And it was the same guy in charge of the cavalry basically every time.
It was
Prince Rupert, if I recall.
Prince Rupert. That's correct.
Who was the king's cousin or something.
Yeah.
And he might have been a competent cavalry commander, but he did not maintain discipline. And unlike him, Oliver Cromwell did.
Yeah.
And battle after battle, as the Civil War progressed, the parliamentary and cavalry successfully rallied after pushing an enemy off the field, reorganized, and then charged back into the fray. And the royalist cavalry just wasn't able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that also speaks to one of the kind of dividing lines of the English Civil War is it really was the nobility versus the parliament, but at the time, because they hadn't made this rule yet, the House of Commons, as it's now known, was largely made up of military leaders. A lot of the Puritans were military leaders.
Kind of, though. You have to remember that Parliament itself included a bunch of nobles, including Thomas Fairfax and including Oliver Cromwell. They just weren't high nobles.
Right.
They were landed gentry, though. They were gentlemen who were independently wealthy. Cromwell was actually one of the poorest for his time. At about when he was a young man, he had an estate that earned him about £300 a year. Now, I don't know what that translates into today's money with inflation and such, but he was on the more broke end of the gentry.
Yeah.
So it was really minor nobles versus major more.
Yes. But you kind of see the divide in the way that like commands are structured, because you have these very seasoned, battle-hardened officers that are more on the Protestant side, whereas the noble officers, I mean, or the high noble officers rather, you kind of see that war was a bit of a lark for them. You know, they're very much LARPing at being soldiers, whereas the Protestants act more like actual soldiers.
Well, that was the interesting thing. Rupert was actually a 15-year veteran or something of the 30 Years' War. He'd been fighting for over a decade on the continent successfully.
Yeah.
So I think probably the idea of the new model army, I think that was probably true. The idea, not that anyone had never occurred to anyone to be more disciplined. No, that had happened a bunch. But in England anyway, it seems that the Protestants' focus on discipline and restraint and command and control really paid off for them in war.
Yep.
In a way that wasn't mostly seen on the continent, other than occasionally with the Swedes when Gustav Adolphus was alive.
Yep. Yeah, and it's you also you get to see a bit of a transition in warfare in this war in particular, where you go from Parliament having to raise armies and the king having to raise armies in kind of the old medieval fashion to the new model army, as you mentioned, being a standing professional army, at least until it's disbanded for the first time.
Yes. Yeah, that was really an interesting shift for the English. And again, it's not the first time anyone had a standing army, but it is probably the first time in a long time that Britain had a standing army.
Yeah. And you'll see that become the norm as, you know, the 17th century turns into the 18th century, especially with the rise of the Prussians, who really reinvent this idea of the standing professional army and become the gold standard. But England does continue this, especially it's more of a naval tradition with the English moving forward. But, you know, as history moves on and England and Prussia and these other kind of regions in Europe gain more influence, you see them adopt this model of a standing professional army.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of the battlefield performance, especially in the cavalry, it was notable. But that's kind of the historical context. Like it was a mess, and a lot of the production of weapons and arms of various sorts, armor, was scattered throughout the country. And so when I was reading in Cromwell's letters, at first it's him organizing like his little local area. He's not part of the larger conflict yet. And so it's him basically trying to get one county organized and under control. And then they're going off and fighting in the neighboring counties, or waiting to hear what's going on in the larger war, and there's a lack of information. It's very interesting to read. I mean, the guy did wind up ending as a tyrant, in the sense that he did the thing that ultimately he rebelled against. He had rebelled against a king who disbanded Parliament unlawfully. And what did he do? He unlawfully disbanded Parliament. when he was in charge.
Mhm.
So he wasn't any better as far as that went.
Yep. Yeah, you guys may have seen me post memes about Cromwell and how based he is. I mean, like I gave him the Thug Life sunglasses in the thumbnail here. I did the I did the Haas Delgado meme about Cromwell being born cool, but Cromwell had his issues as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's and he did, generally speaking, try to appeal to his enemies up front, try to make peace with them, try to work with them. But pretty much after the first try, maybe the second, he would just kill you
Yes. Yeah.
if you weren't on board.
Hmm. Yeah, and when you look at like Solomon Kane as an example, kind of the most popular fictional Puritan, you can see a lot of this kind of Cromwellian energy in Solomon Kane. You can easily imagine that Solomon Kane at some point uh, rode in the parliamentarian cavalry. In fact, I'm pretty sure some attempts at giving Solomon Kane an origin story have him be a veteran of the English Civil War.
That
So,
makes sense.
yeah.
Yeah. Now, as far as the religious context, though, the goofy part, the way this winds up ending, right,
Yeah.
isn't just, of course, with Charles getting himself executed through stubbornness and betrayal, his betrayal of others mostly, but and his son becoming king. What's interesting to me is that in effect, the Scottish Presbyterians won. They just didn't know it for about 40 years.
Yep.
And the reason is because when William of Orange finally wound up becoming co-ruler of England, overthrowing his father-in-law, this is in the I want to say the 1580s or so, or no, 1680s or so. He was part of he was a Calvinist who were in communion with the Scottish Presbyterians. They recognized each other as members of the same church. And I know that because behind me, I have a book that was printed in 1643 that was printed in the Netherlands in English, acknowledging the Presbyterian Church as part of the same universal church.
Hmm. Yep, and it's kind of out of that context that you get a document that I still hold to be binding and something that I have taken an oath to as a member of the Presbyterian Church of America, and that is the Westminster Confession of Faith, which kind of canonizes Calvinist doctrine within the Church of England, at least until they decided to stop doing that.
Yes. Yes.
But there are still denominations that hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and mine is one of them. So, um, that context of all of this fighting, which produces this document that I still have read and have memorized several of the catechism questions and stuff. That's something that kind of resonates with me today.
Oh yeah. I mean, they lost the war, of course. Cromwell was victorious, but
Hmm.
Cromwell's victory lasted like 3 years after his death. That's it. And then the monarchy was restored, and then proceeded to fail to breed itself with any heirs, and was supplanted by by a husband and wife duo. The lady being the daughter of one of the kings, but they had a series of like brothers inheriting from each other because
Hmm.
none of them had kids, at least ones that lived.
Yep.
So the story ended weird, but the period itself would have been a terrible time to be alive.
Yeah.
As far as if you were just a common person trying to live your life quietly, this England was not where to live.
Hmm. And honestly, the rest of Europe is not much better, which is why you see so many people flee Europe in droves, particularly, and this is where, not to keep bringing the conversation back to me, but this is where my family history kind of comes from, because my family were Ulster Scots. And we haven't talked a little bit about this because it's a very small piece of the kind of grand totality of the English Civil War. Um, but the Ulster Plantation was constantly under assault from the Irish. It was just periods of the Irish converging on the Scottish settlers in Ulster, who were Presbyterian, whereas as we know, the Irish were and still are at least nominally Catholic.
Mm.
Um, they would come in, they would beat up on the Ulster Scots until England would send over soldiers, or the Covenanters would come over and help out their brothers in Ulster. Then there'd be peace, and then there was war again. So a lot of them just decided, we're gonna go to the Carolinas and we're gonna farm tobacco, and that's that's where my family comes into the picture.
The irony is that Cromwell wound up deporting tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of Irish to the New World as well.
Yep.
As part of his effort to not have any further wars, he basically, the soldiers whose surrender were accepted, or other people that the English captured, were deported essentially as slaves. Indentured servants who typically couldn't earn their freedom. So that's just slaves.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something, again, that's because of the way that narratives now apparently have to be written. What a lot of people don't realize is a lot of the Irish and a lot of the Scots arrived in the New World in chains.
Yeah.
But that's not talked about because it doesn't fit into the little tidy box of what court historians have decided slavery was.
Yeah, no, that was a typical way to deal with enemies that wasn't just murdering them.
Yeah.
This wasn't unique to the English Civil War. It wasn't unique to even Europeans. I mean, the Assyrians did the exact same thing, deporting whole populations and splitting them up so that they wouldn't be a military threat later.
Yep. The Romans also practiced this heavily.
Yeah.
Although the Romans would also, like, if you upset them enough, would just march in and slaughter you as well. See
Yeah.
Jerusalem.
Yeah. I see John's comment there. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. It is.
Yeah.
I will say, even though I've made Cromwell memes and definitely fall on the Protestant side of this, I understand, as someone who believes that a person's confessional heritage is sacrosanct. I understand where you're coming from, John.
Yeah, he was I suspect doing everything he could to provoke anyone who might fight into fighting him then.
Yep. So we've talked a lot about the Civil War itself.
Sure.
To kind of pivot into the topic of role-playing games, I think it should be apparent from this conversation how taking some of these ideas and porting them over to a fantasy world could be interesting for campaigns. But let's talk a little bit about this, because
Oh yeah.
I don't know about yourself, but I've found that a lot of people tend to shy away from using religion as a massive, like, motivator of happenstance in role-playing games. I think it's because people don't understand religion anymore. They don't understand the concept of being so devoted to a religion that you are willing to fight and die for it anymore. So a lot of people just kind of ignore it. It's basically, this is how my cleric gets superpowers, and that's the only thing they do with it.
Right. So, I mean, you've got a few different kind of levels of conflict. Simple religious conflict's very easy. The idea of we're going to kill those creatures because they're evil, not because they're like say you've got goblins who are eating children or something. That's a pretty easy moral question. Should you stop them, or killing zombies or this kind of thing? It's not a hard moral question. It's a more difficult moral question, though, if it's other people like yourself, other humans or demi-humans, people who have a soul, who are like you, and they don't agree with you about something that you find very important. Now, whether this is about what the right thing to do is, I'll give you an example. Is it right to kill the unborn? Yes or no? Well, that today is a point of religious conflict in our country. That's a point of political and religious discussion and disagreement. Well, you can imagine this, but writ large, and if you've got people who are really dedicated to both ideas, you'd have one group who's out murdering children in the womb, and you'd have another group who's out killing those people. That's what you would get in a real religious sectarian violence over that issue if you'd stuck it in a role-playing game.
Yep.
You'd have essentially civil and religious strife until one side won out, or until a third party seized power and was able to pacify both groups.
Yep.
And that's what you'll see in history. And what the thing they're fighting about can vary wildly. I mean, Charles here was basically fighting for the divine right of kings, if he can be said to have been fighting for anything.
Yeah.
No one agreed with him in England or Scotland. Not really. It was just varying degrees of disagreement. And so, and the Presbyterians, right, were fighting for largely Calvinist religious beliefs. But that isn't true for the Puritans. They were similar, but not the same. Right. And the Irish did not like either of them.
Yeah.
And so you've got basically 3 or 4, depending on how you count, major religious viewpoints, all in what was all united in one man. And then when he died, united in his son as the point of conflict. I mean, you could really have a lot of fun with that in a role-playing game, I think. Yeah. For example, you could have, if you wanted paragons of this, you could have a king who believes one thing, one religious view. You could have his wife believe another. And then you could have the king's closest advisor be the head of a third religious view. And you would create that powder keg, but you'd also give them individual leaders for the players to interact with.
Yeah. And to get metaphysical here for a minute, because both of us are religious individuals. We both are openly religious.
Yeah. And
also because tabletop games allow for you to reach this metaphysical level, in D&D in particular, you can visit hell, you can fight demons. So I think both of us would probably agree that what you have in the English Civil War is a horrible conflict between people who should agree, because at the end of the day, whether Congregationalist, Presbyterian, or Catholic, hopefully everyone believes that Christ was the Son of God, the Savior of sinners, and that he was fully God and fully man, and that he died for our sins and is a living Savior that was resurrected. And so any division sowed amongst people who believe those fundamental truths comes from the enemy. So to take this
that
back,
belief should have been enough.
Yeah. to take this back into the realm of D&D, maybe you can have in your campaign world a demon or a creature from some other realm that is planting seeds of discontent amongst people with religious differences that should otherwise get along, but because there is this manipulator factor involved, this worm tongue type figure that you have injected into your game, they're not getting along, and there's a massive war as a result of the manipulation
Oh
of
yeah.
a third metaphysical force.
Oh yeah. No, that can be a lot of fun. And to address John's question, it wasn't so much that the or comment. It wasn't so much that the king had no supporters. He did. He definitely did. It was that even his supporters did not generally agree that he could do whatever he wanted in all circumstances, which was essentially the view he was arguing. Even the people who were fighting for him in the war mostly didn't actually agree with that. And you can tell both from their writings and from the times when they were fighting against him, because almost everyone at some point fought against him, because he, as I said, kept switching sides, essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a role-playing game, I think that also the lack of information, the localized production of arms, the confusion that a country or continent-wide conflict can have in an era without instantaneous communications is something you can really play up. You can have rumors coming in about how things are going, but until you get someone who arrives who is in an actual battle, it may be weeks or months before your players, unless they go adventuring, if they stay in one area, before they even know what's really happening.
Yeah.
And that seems to have been the experience for quite a lot of people during this time. Not just in the English Civil War, but also in the 30 Years' War.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then just to shout out one of my friends here and someone that I've been working a lot with, Wonky here in chat. He and I have had a lot of conversations about the concept of uh, a demon or some kind of other evil entity masquerading as a good or lawful god, and that kind of concept in a campaign setting. And you can definitely see,
Sure, like in Revelation.
yeah, you can definitely see echoes of that in um, the English Civil War. You can see this idea of people think both sides definitely thought that they were fighting for the greater good in some sense, and ultimately they weren't, because the God would never have us killing our brethren.
Yeah, that is the tragedy of Oliver Cromwell. If you read his early writing, he seems to have been, I mean, a fairly nice guy who cared about other people and was trying to persuade them to follow God and to follow Christ. And that is not how things ended.
Mm-hmm.
As time went on, he became more merciless.
Yeah, definitely. Now, another interesting aspect that I think can really make for an interesting concept to explore in role playing, um, after this period of time, after the English Civil War, as you have with pretty much any period where a long running war ends and now you have a period of peace, you have battle hardened, experienced fighting men with no more wars to fight. And so you have this question of what do these men do with themselves? In the case of the English Civil War, a lot of them got on ships and became privateers and turned into what we now know as the Caribbean pirates. Um, in the case of a role playing game, you now have opportunities to create new factions of these soldiers, let's say you're playing in a game where something similar to the English Civil War has just occurred. So now you have these kind of wandering droves of fighting men with, nothing to do, no more wars to fight. What do those guys do with themselves? Well, there was more conflict in the New World for the fighting men of the English Civil War. So are they now going to pick fights with other nations? Are they going to just wander around and become bandit chieftains? Um, you
Oh
have
yeah.
this kind of rich uh, kind of
Oh,
field of adversaries to draw from now that you have again battle hardened, experienced fighting men with no more wars to fight.
one goofy thing that did happen is Bermuda, of all places, held out until 2 years before the end of this period as loyalists to the king. And they managed to get a separate peace, and their parliament never got overthrown, which has resulted in the Parliament of Bermuda being one of the longest sitting parliaments in history.
Hmm.
Just a weird, because they managed to make peace without having to fight the parliamentarian faction, because they held out for so long and had really quite good defenses.
Hmm.
Um, just a goofy thing, and then they of course became one of the hubs for the privateers,
Yep.
or continued to be.
Hmm.
Um, but you also had the a subsequent group of wars, although shorter ones mostly take place, um, including between the English and the Dutch. Um, and and so I think a lot of them, wound up, from what I can tell, settling. A lot of them wound up settling down, but a fair number went into mercenary or privateering work, like you said.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, and Percy Block here in chat, form private military companies. Yeah, you can have a lot of fun with kind of creating your medieval PMCs in that regard.
Oh, those were common
Yep.
in the period, for sure. Like mercenary companies, some with a history going for dozens, some for hundreds of years. Yeah, that was a thing.
I mean, that's basically what the Hessians were. Now that's a century later, but
True, true. Paid troops.
yep.
But no, you had named companies who had, who had officers, and they were typically paid, the officer, by the number of men who showed up
Hmm.
at the. You know how we have military parades and drills and stuff where you show off the brigade or that kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah, that tradition originates from a review to determine how many men there were to figure out how much to pay the colonel
Nice.
when
I
you were
love it.
paid by your head count, by the men you could bring to battle.
Hmm. Yep. And as Percy Block points out, the Vatican Swiss Guard are also mercenaries, or were mercenaries, I guess.
I think they,
Technically not anymore, but
yeah, yeah.
so yeah, I mean, it's an idea, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is I talk a lot about how people need to get back to this tradition of the clash of arms being the ultimate goal of D&D. And you see the Bro SR talking about building up to um, massive pitched battles with giant armies. You see this conversation kind of happening over and over again. And what a lot of people wonder is, how do you get to that point? How in your campaign world do you create a situation where now you have massive armies that are fighting each other? And as you can see from history, one of the fastest ways to get something like that going is some kind of sectarian conflict. Um, you don't even need like a war of succession to jumpstart something like that. You need just religious differences, and they can even be minor religious differences to kick off a full scale war.
Yeah, and well, you add in cultural as well. So, for the English Civil War, we didn't even talk about the Welsh, who were at this point largely part of England,
Hmm.
but were typically royalist, and so they had to be conquered and kind of put down to prevent them from continuing to provide the king with troops.
Yep.
And um, but you're adding in there's at least 4 distinct cultures involved in this war as well, in these series of wars,
Yep.
as well as 3 or 4 distinct religious viewpoints. Like, that's quite a mess. Those places wouldn't naturally be part of the same kingdom.
Hmm.
Left to their own devices, the Welsh would clearly have rather governed themselves.
Yep.
The Scots too, and the same for the Irish. It was
Yep.
only because of intermarriage, death, and succession laws that they wound up, and some conquest, that they wound up as under a single monarch.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it didn't seem like any of them really liked it that much.
Mhm. Yeah, and even to this day, even up until I believe it was 2016 was the last time there was a stay remain or a secede remain vote for Scotland in the
Yeah,
United Kingdom. So even today, there's seeds of the Scottish and the Welsh and the Irish not wanting to be subjects of the United Kingdom anymore.
right. Yeah, so it's very interesting, how that all came about. Um, and Charles' dad was smarter than him, demonstrably,
Yeah.
in that he managed to keep the peace
Hmm.
among all these factions. And Charles couldn't even ultimately keep one group on his side permanently,
Yeah.
which is just crazy. Like, if he had just gone, "Yep, I'm pro-Catholic, Catholic all the way," that would have helped more than what
Yep.
he actually did. Or Presbyterian or Puritan or anything at all.
Hmm.
It's just very surprising to me, that he didn't learn. His son did. His son learned. His son basically pardoned everyone who wasn't egregiously loyal to the parliamentarian cause. I mean, parliamentarian generals helped him take over, including the formerly retired Thomas Fairfax, Cromwell's former superior, including George Monk, I think his name was, and a number of other prominent leaders. They actually are the ones who invited him back to take over
Hmm.
after having not only defeated his father in war, but having defeated him when he was declared the king, Charles II, of both Scotland and Ireland. They beat him and drove him off. The same
Hmm.
guys wound up going, "Yeah, actually, you probably should have been king."
Yep.
It's just, and he had a fairly peaceful transition of power, which which was pretty cool.
Hmm.
I don't know, what did you think of that? How it ends?
It, ultimately, it does kind of come down to this exercise in futility. Just all of these lives spent, all of this bloodshed,
For
just
nothing.
for Cromwell to become a dictator, and then turns out, hey, we were wrong. We want to bring the king back.
Yeah. The funny part is that son of Cromwell's, it was like his third or fourth son, who became Lord Protector after him briefly,
Hmm.
was the longest lived ruler of England until Elizabeth II. Now, he wasn't ruler, of course, for most of that time. He
Hmm.
lived on the continent for most of his life, but he died at the age of 85.
Hmm.
which was quite rare, and he had the record for the longest lived ruler of England until Queen Elizabeth.
But yeah, it's a positively fascinating period of history. And then there's one more thing I want to discuss, and this is something that I just want to discuss briefly, um, since we are kind of at the end of our time here. The technology that is used in this particular era of history is something that I personally find extremely fascinating.
Oh, like the wheel locks?
Well, yeah, we're dealing with wheel lock pistols, but you have in this period this fusion between the old way and the new way, where you still have armored pikemen and you still have heavy use of swords and pole arms and hand-to-hand combat uh, in these massive pitched battles, but you also have artillery and musketeers, and you have dragoons that are using early carbines. So there's a lot of innovative and interesting technology, and this is the transition point from ancient warfare to modern warfare in a lot of ways.
Oh, from medieval to modern.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's pretty cool. I think the War of the Roses is probably better for that if you want to play like most medieval style role playing games. There's less rules you'd have to mess with to emulate
Mhm.
that period. The English Civil Wars, you definitely are leaning much more into firearms,
Yes.
though not exclusively. Saber charges still very much a thing. Just typically after you'd emptied all your pistols.
Yeah.
You're like, well, okay, they haven't broken. Fine, let's charge. But and the armor, of course, changed. You were having a far greater emphasis on buff coats or brigandines compared to like plate armor.
Yeah.
Like if you were a wealthy nobleman, you weren't in full plate. You were in a buff coat, or you had a brigandine on to protect yourself,
Mhm.
which is interesting. It showed that to some extent, um, the mobility was more important.
Yeah.
And as far as pikes go, do you know the last time that I'm aware of that pikes were raised for war?
If I'm not mistaken, there were, well, I know for a fact um, the Alabama regulars in the Confederacy
You got it.
were heavily armed with pikes at one point, just because
Yep.
that's what they had.
That is the last time I'm aware of anyone deliberately raising a force of pikes. And so, we're not too far off of that here with the English Civil War, a couple hundred
Mhm.
years, maybe 300. But they were definitely on the way out. But the pikes and the cavalry were very much where it was at as far as winning the battle. Um, if you look at most of these battles, it was the press of the pikes or it was the wheeling of the cavalry that tended to decide the day. It wasn't typically the guys with the guns, which is not what you'd see now.
Right.
Or the guys with the long arms, I should say. The cavalry had pistols. But
Mhm.
yeah, just I think it probably had to do with the rate of fire. I don't think you could, if I recall correctly, you couldn't, once you'd emptied the guns you had, you couldn't realistically get off more than a shot a minute. And I don't even think you could get that with wheel locks.
Right. Yeah. It's really not until the flintlock, and even some would say the percussion lock guns, that you get to where a trained soldier can fire. Uh, I think it was 10 shots a minute
Yeah.
in the Civil War was what doctrine dictated from riflemen. But
Yep. And
yeah,
that's quick enough to repel cavalry,
mhm,
especially with bayonets on the end as well.
yep. But yeah, at this point, you weren't anywhere near 10 aimed shots in a minute. You were well afield of that.
Yeah. And so as a result, they didn't, I mean, they were impactful, but they weren't as impactful as later in history.
Right.
Cannons, though, those
Oh
would
yeah.
sometimes win battles.
Hmm.
Um, and every once in a while, you'd get something goofy like, and it happened at least in one of the battles in the English Civil War, where soldiers from one army capture the cannon of the other army and start firing them at their own army. And this wasn't something the English trained for. It just happened in one battle.
Hmm.
Whereas the Swedes did this on purpose. Like they actually cross-trained soldiers as artillerymen so that when they took enemy artillery, they could turn them on them.
Hmm.
But it happened at least once in the English Civil War. It was listening to the account of that battle, that was pretty funny. I'm just like, really? You're firing their own artillery at them? Okay.
Hey, you work with the tools you've got in front of you.
Yeah. Weird thing though, artillery at the time, what you were trying to do was a grazing shot. You were trying to basically skip it like a stone across water, the ball, so it would go through multiple ranks of troops.
Yep.
Instead of, um, hitting the target hard, unless you were aiming for like a wall or something. But
Yep.
on a battlefield, you were trying to get like essentially a skipping shot. And so you had to train as an artilleryman to shoot in a very odd way
Hmm.
to make that happen.
Was that due to the lack of velocity that cannons could get at that point?
It's because they weren't explosive rounds.
That's fair.
They're just balls. And
Yep.
so skipping through a bunch of enemy troops, you'll kill way more than just pounding down and hitting one spot.
Yep.
Yeah. Pretty cool stuff though. And if anyone is interested, I would love to do a short campaign focused around this kind of technology, either of Horde Wars or of something else,
Hmm.
because it's a really cool thing. And the weapons, like the pistols and the cannon, would be very impactful. But the firing rate means once you discharge it, that's it. You're switching to swords or pikes.
Yep.
And I think that would be doable. Like that wouldn't be a hard hack in most medieval role playing games.
Hmm. Yep. And I will say, for those of you who are looking to what myself and Wonky are doing, we're very much kind of entrenched in this level of technology in what we're working on for Guts and Glory. Nighthaven in particular,
Sweet.
very much has an early black powder feel to it.
When are you going to be releasing that?
So the first adventure we're going to be putting out, it'll actually be two adventures, one written by Wonky and one by myself. That'll come out on December 25th. It'll be our Christmas present to everyone. And then from there, we'll be looking at, a couple adventures a year, depending on scheduling.
Okay. And will they be sequels to one another?
So this one, because it's coming out on Christmas, this one will be holiday themed. And from there, we'll be looking at kind of, sequels. And we'll be talking a lot about this. Next week, I'll be on Natural Ones, and I'm pretty sure Wonky will be joining me on Natural Ones. And then we're also going to go on Talking Crit with Bad
Cool.
Mike and Tenkar to discuss this in the coming weeks.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. By the way, are you planning to come and play in a one shot at some point? I've invited you a couple times.
I would love to. I just need to find, because I've been crunching on getting this adventure done in time for Christmas.
Sure.
I haven't had a lot of time, so I will need to make time to join in a one shot with you.
All right. Well, if you hop on that Gilded server,
Mhm.
the one I set up for Horde Wars.
Yeah.
We've got one shots scheduled, and you can just see which ones are open.
Sweet.
So that'd be a lot of fun, though. I'd love to do that with you as well. And if you get the chance, once you've got your adventure released, if you're willing to run it, I'd love to give it a try.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, guys, that is going to do it for Rollin Bones this evening. Before we wrap up, Blackwall, do you have any further thoughts? Anything you want to kind of close on or discuss?
Sure. If you could put anything on a T-shirt, what would it be?
If I could put anything on a T-shirt, what would it be?
Yes.
So we are in the season of Christmas. So in that spirit, I'm going to revise an old answer of mine, and it will be a cavalry charge led by Jesus and Santa Claus in kind of a Renaissance painting style, and the caption will say "War on Christmas."
That's good. That's good. But beyond that, I would say in general, for a takeaway, lack of information, political and sectarian conflict make for a very interesting campaign setting and series of adventures. And in real life, this period of the English Civil Wars lasted for like 15 years.
Yep.
So you could have an entire campaign take place in the midst of a series of conflicts focused around these kinds of religious and political themes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, guys, next week we will be having a very, very interesting and what I imagine will be a very spirited conversation and even debate with myself, Greg Lambert, the creator of Ares Chronicles, and Gelatinous Rube, and we will be talking about magic items. You guys have probably heard Rube get in your face about magic items at some point. So we are going to be having a conversation about how to use magic items, how rare or how common they should be, what economy should look like around magic items in D&D, and this will be a very interesting conversation, and it's definitely one where there's going to be a lot of strong opinions thrown around. So I hope you guys will join us for that. Until then, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I am so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, and I will see you guys next time.